Nietzsche, why arguing is for weak people. When silence becomes strength. What if arguing isn't strength, but a silent cry for recognition? In a world obsessed with being right, we often mistake reaction for power and volume for truth. But Nietzsche saw beyond the surface. He believed that silence, when born from clarity, is the loudest statement of all. This video isn't here to teach you how to win arguments. It's an invitation to step back, to ask, what am I really defending? Is it truth or a fragile identity needing to be seen? Let's explore why silence may be stronger than shouting, and why those who no longer need to be understood may finally understand life. This isn't about walking away from people. It's about walking toward a deeper version of yourself. When arguing is seen as intelligence, but is it really? Imagine a world where every conversation turns into a debate, where winning an argument is seen as the pinnacle of intelligence. From a young age, we are taught that eloquence, sharp reasoning, and silencing others are signs of being smart. But have you ever paused and asked yourself, is arguing truly a sign of strength, or merely a clever mask to hide something more fragile? Friedrich Nietzsche, one of the most controversial and profound thinkers in history, offered a completely different perspective. He did not view arguing as a triumph, but rather as a symptom of an unrecognized weakness. For Nietzsche, the strong are not those who can silence others in a verbal clash, but those who can remain grounded in silence, holding inner clarity even when they are misunderstood or denied. Could it be that many of us are trying too hard to win in a conversation, simply to fill an inner void? Perhaps what we're defending isn't the truth, but an image of ourselves, a fear of being dismissed, misunderstood, or rejected. This video does not aim to teach you how to argue more effectively. On the contrary, it invites you to look deeper into the true motivation behind every moment you feel the urge to speak your mind. Perhaps, in that very moment, you are standing at a threshold, not to defeat another, but to understand yourself a little better. According to Nietzsche, the truly strong have no need to argue in defense of their views, because they do not live according to the consensus of the majority. They stand alone, not in isolation, but in freedom. They are not silent out of fear of speaking, but because they have transcended the fear of not being heard. They have escaped the common psychological trap, equating self-worth with the approval of others. This does not mean we should withdraw from the world or stop connecting with others. Rather, it means there are moments when our silence is the wisest response, not because we have nothing to say, but because we understand that not everything needs to be said in that silence. There is freedom, there is intentional choice, there is inner dignity. If you've ever been misunderstood simply because you didn't react, if you've ever been seen as weak just because you refused to argue, then remember, perhaps you are the one who has already stepped into a quiet form of maturity, where you no longer need to win the argument because you've already won yourself. Behind every argument, there is a trembling ego. Why do people argue? Is it to protect the truth? Sometimes, yes, but most of the time, what we are trying to protect isn't the truth, it's a threatened ego. Friedrich Nietzsche believed that the core of most arguments comes from a fragile self, a fear of not being acknowledged, a sense of incompleteness, trying to prove its worth through the eyes of others. Nietzsche didn't call on us to abandon dialogue or critical thinking. He simply posed a question worth reflecting on. What is truly driving you in that argument? Is it the desire for understanding, or the fear of being looked down on? Is it the will to connect, or the need to win in order to feel valuable? When you pause and are honest with yourself, you may realize most of the times we feel the urge to speak up urgently are the very moments when something inside us is unsettled, and in the moment you recognize that, instead of continuing the battle, you've already taken the first step out of a war you never really needed to fight. That is the beginning of healing. The authentic don't need to prove anything. There is a profound stillness in those who no longer need to be recognized. They don't strain to be heard, nor rush to be understood. They walk through life as if their very presence says all there is to say. Nietzsche called this the quality of the authentic. Those who are no longer controlled by the desire for praise or the fear of rejection. In his masterpiece, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche introduced the image of the Übermensch, the overman, Not someone strong in a physical sense, but someone who has transcended social conditioning, the need for comparison, and most of all, the urge to prove anything to anyone. The authentic do not argue because they don't live to be right. They live to be real. They understand that the value of something doesn't depend on others agreeing with it, and that very inner freedom is what gives them their strange magnetism, the ability to be fully present without needing attention, to exist without trying to dominate. In today's world, where reputation, likes, and comments can shape the self-worth of an entire generation, living authentically without the need to prove oneself is almost rebellious. But it is also the only path to true inner wholeness. When you stop seeking validation from the outside, you begin to find something far more precious, a self that doesn't need a performance. And when you live this way, you no longer need to win any argument because the way you live has already become your answer. When you resist just to survive, you are being defined by others. Many of us grow up with the feeling that we must fight back in order to be seen, that we must resist to assert our existence. But Nietzsche offered a warning. When you live merely as a reaction to the world, you are no longer yourself. You're allowing others to determine the direction of your life, simply because you are constantly opposing them. This is the state Nietzsche called resentment, a form of negative reactive energy. People who live in resentment define themselves not by the values they build, but by opposition to others. They don't truly know who they are. They only know who they are not the person they resent, oppose, or are desperately trying to prove something to. The painful truth is that many heated arguments do not arise from deep convictions, but from suppressed emotions, feelings of helplessness, rejection, or simply the pain of never having been seen for who one truly is. And because they cannot bear that sense of invisibility, they use argument to scream, "I am here." But Nietzsche posed a deeply human challenge. Will you live as a reaction or as a creation? If you are constantly triggered by the external world, then you are letting it lead your life. But if you are calm enough to pause, to look within, and ask, "Who am I when I no longer need to resist?" That is the beginning of an authentic self. Inner strength does not come from overpowering others in an argument, but from no longer letting them define who you are. When you stop living to oppose, you begin living to exist. And that is true freedom. Inner strength never needs to be acknowledged. We often confuse real strength with the display of strength. Those who speak loudly, argue fiercely, and react intensely are often labeled by society as strong. But Nietzsche saw something entirely different. These displays are not strength, but signs of inner insecurity, struggling to be covered up. Inner strength, according to Nietzsche, is quiet. It needs no recognition, no applause, no agreement. It shows up in calmness when misunderstood, in the ability to stand by one's values even when they are rejected, in choosing not to react to every attack, because you clearly know what is true and what is not worth bringing into your mind. What's concerning is that modern society has blurred this definition of strength. In a world that worships image, performance, and winning, those who are quiet, non-reactive, and unprovoked are often labeled as weak or lacking courage, but the truth might be the complete opposite. Nietzsche did not encourage people to withdraw from the world, but to pause before reacting, to listen to themselves before responding, and to act from inner strength, not from defensive instinct. If you've ever felt that you're not strong enough because you can't argue sharply, can't win verbal battles, or don't express yourself easily, ask yourself, are you truly weak, or have you simply stopped living for praise? Because truly strong people don't need to win in order to feel valuable. They possess value even in silence. Are you defending the truth or clinging to a fractured ego? There are times we argue with all our might, believing we're standing for the truth. But Nietzsche posed a profound question. Is what you're defending truly the truth? Or just a part of you that fears collapsing if you let go of that belief? Because sometimes what we call conviction is merely the last shell holding our ego together. In every argument, there's a subtle danger. We shift from seeking understanding to defending the self. Each counterpoint is no longer heard as a perspective, but felt as a personal threat. And suddenly, we are no longer fighting for truth, but for the safety of our identity. Nietzsche understood this deeply. He believed that those who cannot accept being challenged have never truly journeyed inward. They live in a world of superficial certainty, afraid that if one belief crumbles, their entire ego might fall apart. In such cases, arguing is no longer an exchange of ideas, but an unconscious survival battle. This is when we must pause and ask ourselves, what am I really trying to prove? And if I am no longer right, who am I then? If that question leaves you feeling empty, that is not failure. It is an invitation to begin a deeper journey of healing, the journey of letting go of the stories we tell about ourselves, in order to discover a self that doesn't need to be right, only real. When you no longer cling to right and wrong as a shield, you finally begin to listen not just to others, but to yourself. And in that space, life becomes a dialogue, not a battlefield. Will to power. The will to strength begins from within. In Nietzsche's philosophy, the concept of will to power is not simply the desire to dominate or control others. On the contrary, it is a powerful life force that urges humans to constantly surpass themselves, to explore, redefine, and refine the deepest layers of their being. However, Nietzsche warned that most people have lost the direction of that strength. They don't use it for inner development, but to manipulate others, win arguments, or maintain social power. They mistakenly believe that imposing their ideas on others is a sign of strength. But in reality, that is merely a sign of dependence on external approval. True strength, according to Nietzsche, is the ability to shape oneself. Despite resistance from the world, it's living in alignment with personal values. Even if that path leads to loneliness or misunderstanding, it's knowing clearly what you want, what you need, and having the courage to choose it without asking for permission. More importantly, Nietzsche believed that a person is only truly strong when they are no longer pulled into unnecessary battles, especially those arguments that seek not understanding, but dominance. Because if your life force is drained by the need to prove, you won't have the space to create anything of depth within. Will to power is not the will to conquer others, but the will to continuously become a more whole version of yourself. And to do that, the first thing you must learn is to stay silent in front of things no longer worthy of your presence. When the fear of abandonment drives us to argue for acceptance, there are arguments whose true cause doesn't lie in the content, but in the feeling of being abandoned. Many people argue not to clarify a point, but out of fear of losing connection, they argue to be heard, to be seen, to affirm, I still exist in this relationship. Behind the logic stands an inner child, panicking from the sense of being cut off. Nietzsche did not speak of this using the language of modern psychology, but through his deep critiques of the ego and our dependence on others' gaze, he touched on the root of this emotion. When you are not whole within, you will always seek external validation, and when that validation is threatened, you react, you argue as a way of clinging to your place in someone's heart. Understanding this doesn't make you weaker. It helps you see others through more compassionate eyes. Instead of going on the defensive, you can listen more deeply, going beyond words to reach the unspoken need sometimes. The words I disagree actually mean, I'm afraid you'll leave me. When you understand this, arguments are no longer battlefields. They become opportunities to heal, opportunities to stay, opportunities to affirm, you don't have to be like me for me to choose to stay with you. And that is love, the kind that doesn't need to win. Nietzsche once said, the individual has always had to struggle not to be overwhelmed by the tribe. If you try to do something different, you will be lonely and sometimes frightened, but no price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself. And that has never been more true than in the digital age. Online, arguing is no longer about seeking knowledge. It has become a race to see who can rebut faster, sharper, louder. The more people watching, the greater the pressure to save face. But the truth is, those who feel compelled to respond immediately are often the ones most out of control. They don't argue to understand. They argue to avoid feeling left out. We forget that every time you are provoked and instantly react, you hand over control of your emotions to someone else. Nietzsche never advocated indifference, but he did warn against energies wasted on meaningless battles, where truth matters less than keeping the ego intact. If you've ever felt drained after an online argument, if you've ever lost sleep over a negative comment, ask yourself, what exactly am I defending? And is it truly worth sacrificing my inner peace? Perhaps what you need right now isn't a sharper comeback, but the courage not to respond, to choose stillness, not out of weakness, but because you've begun to understand the truth doesn't need to shout, it only needs to be lived. Arguing to be loved, the deepest wound no one names, no one wants to admit they're arguing just to be loved. But in truth, for many people, arguing is no longer a matter of logic. It's an unconscious attempt to hold on to connection. When you feel forgotten, dismissed, or misunderstood, you might start an argument to draw the other person's attention, as if speaking louder might make them stay longer. Nietzsche might not have used the psychological terms we use today, but he saw this clearly in those he called victims of the immature ego. They think they're fighting for their beliefs, but really they're struggling not to be left behind. One of humanity's deepest fears isn't being wrong, it's being abandoned when we are wrong. Many relationships don't fall apart due to differing views, but because no one dares to say what they truly need. I want you to listen. I want you to stay, even if I'm not perfect. And instead of expressing this, people choose to argue. They argue to prove I'm worthy. They argue to hide the wounds left by not being loved the right way. But you cannot make someone love you by winning an argument. Love doesn't come from persuasion, but from authentic presence. And that can only begin when you're willing to lay down your weapons. When you stop speaking to be right and begin speaking to be understood. If you've ever cried after an argument, not because you were wrong, but because you felt the growing distance between you, then you know this feeling. And if you're brave enough to realize, I don't need to be right to be loved, then perhaps that is the first step toward healing, both for yourself and for the relationship. The strong, according to Nietzsche, are not swept away by surface emotions. They have the inner power to turn inward, to speak with themselves before speaking with others. And it is this ability to pause and reflect rather than react that is the true sign of mature intelligence. In a world where everyone is speaking to claim a place, silence is no longer an absence. It becomes a deliberate act, a declaration. I don't need to speak to know who I am. The strong don't use words to persuade. They live in a way that expresses their values. They don't need to win with words, because their lives are the answer. And most importantly, when we turn inward, we not only listen better to others, we begin to listen to ourselves. We recognize the unhealed wounds that drive our reactions, the parts of us that need care and healing. We no longer argue to cover up pain. We begin to live in a way that makes peace with it. If you've ever chosen silence over reaction, if you've ever walked away from an argument without needing to win, perhaps you are stronger than you thought because you didn't trade your inner peace just to prove a point. And that is the beginning of a power no one can take away, the power of self-mastery and clarity. Dialogue is when both are healing, not battling. There is a subtle yet crucial difference between debating and dialogue. Debate is when two egos try to outdo one another. Dialogue is when two souls try to reach each other in a debate. The goal is to win in a dialogue. The goal is to understand. And Nietzsche, despite being known for his confrontational views, held deep respect for the act of true dialogue. He was not against disagreement, but he warned against the kind of interaction where each side focuses solely on defending, attacking, or proving they are more right. Nietzsche believed such arguments lead nowhere. They do not help us grow. They only trap us further in the cycle of ego and resistance. A true dialogue, in the spirit of healing, does not begin with, I'm right, you're wrong, but with the question, can I understand you more deeply? And can I allow you to truly understand me in that moment? Dialogue ceases to be an intellectual tool and becomes a safe space, a space where wounds, differences, and loneliness can be voiced without judgment. In that state, no one needs to win, and no one has to lose. Each person can hold on to their own truth while opening themselves to listen to another's. And in that very moment, something miraculous happens. Both people begin to heal, not through agreement, but through presence and recognition. If there is someone willing to sit across from you, not to rebut, but to truly listen, cherish them, because in a noisy and rushed world, A genuine conversation is a rare treasure. And if you are also willing to be such a person, you are not just transforming one relationship, you are changing the way humans coexist. The emotionally mature don't need to win with words. There comes a point in life when you no longer care about being right. Not because you have nothing to say, but because you begin to realize winning an argument does not bring peace. Inner maturity is when you no longer seek your self-worth by defeating someone else's opinion, but from the quiet confidence that no longer needs validation. Nietzsche understood this well when he wrote, "The strongest ego is the one that does not need to fight." Emotionally immature people often equate silence with failure and believe that not reacting means being overpowered. But the truth is, if you are still easily triggered by others' words, you are still letting the outer world control your inner peace. The emotionally mature choose their responses, rather than being ruled by them. They know when to speak, when to be silent, and most importantly, they know what is truly worth their energy. They don't enter every debate, because they understand that not everyone is ready to listen, and not everything needs to be proven. Instead of winning with words, they win through the way they live. They let their true values show through action, through how they love, how they treat others, and especially how they maintain their inner calm in the midst of chaos. If you've ever walked away from a conversation, not because you had nothing to say, but because you realized some things no longer needed to be said, then you are moving closer to the kind of maturity Nietzsche envisioned. It's not the silence of defeat, but the choice of a soul that no longer lives for validation. And sometimes that is the highest kind of victory, not over someone else, but over your own unyielding ego. Don't miss moments of awakening just because you want to be right. There are moments in life when a disagreement unsettles you, when an opposing view puts you on the defensive, that are actually doors to awakening. But sadly, many of us slam those doors shut for one reason. We're too caught up in the need to be right. Nietzsche didn't only speak of power. He spoke more about the ability to rise above oneself. And to do that, you need one essential quality: humility, to look at yourself. Because every time you feel challenged, it may be an opportunity to uncover a hidden limit within, something you previously believed was the truth. When you argue to protect your view, you might be closing off a new field of awareness. But when you pause and ask, why am I reacting so strongly? What am I afraid of? That moment ceases to be a conflict and becomes a mirror that reflects not just the outer world, but your inner world as well. Nietzsche taught that the strong are not those who are always right, but those who are always willing to grow. And you cannot grow if you're unwilling to let your own rightness be shaken. The ego will resist that, for it fears losing its familiar image, but the soul longs for it because it wants to expand. Awakening doesn't come from winning arguments. It comes from the moment you're awake enough to realize you're standing before an opportunity to change the way you see the world. Don't miss that moment just because you want to be right. Being right may give you short-term safety, but only letting go can lead you to true freedom. There is no absolute truth, only fragments of perception. We grow up believing that truth is something definitive, like the final destination of every argument, but Nietzsche shattered that illusion when he declared, "There are no facts, only interpretations." A statement that makes many uncomfortable, as it strips away the certainty we've clung to, yet it is also one of the most liberating things ever said. Because once you understand that truth is merely a fragment of personal experience, you begin to see the world with greater humility. You stop seeing those who disagree as wrong and start seeing them as different. And that difference no longer threatens you, it expands you, it enriches your awareness if you're brave enough to embrace it. This doesn't mean everything is so relative that it becomes meaningless. Rather, it means you no longer force the world to fit perfectly into your lens. You begin to accept that every person is living their own truth, shaped by memory, wounds, beliefs, and a deeply unique path. Their truth does not invalidate yours. It just comes from a different road. Healing begins there, when you no longer need others to see the world exactly as you do in order to feel safe, when you let go of the need for agreement as a condition for existence, and instead show up with deep respect for the complexity of being human. Nietzsche invites you to step out of the trap of certainty. and into the territory of exploration. There, you are no longer a defender of truth, but a pilgrim expanding your vision, and perhaps that is the most honest path a truly awakened soul can walk. The journey of self-overcoming is one that no one sees. We often imagine strength as something visible, achievements, a powerful voice, winning arguments, or the spotlight before a crowd. But for Nietzsche, the deepest form of strength is the most silent one, the journey of overcoming oneself, a journey that takes place quietly, without applause, without full understanding, and often without any witnesses. Nietzsche called this journey self-overcoming, the essence of all personal growth. It doesn't happen in loud debates or online disputes, but in quiet moments when you face the darkness within, and it doesn't earn applause, but it profoundly changes the way you live, how you see others, and most importantly, how you see yourself. Those who walk this path may appear ordinary on the outside, even quiet, but inside them are silent transformations, rebirths that need no audience. And precisely because they need no recognition, their strength does not come from others. It comes from within, steady and resilient. If you're going through a phase like this, where you're learning not to react as before, where you're focused on rebuilding from within instead of fixing things outside, you are not alone. You are living the very spirit Nietzsche believed to be the only path to true freedom, not waiting for the world to change, but beginning with yourself quietly, but never weakly. Silence does not come from fear, but from clarity. When someone chooses silence in a confrontation, most of society labels them as weak, lacking arguments, afraid to speak up, or unwilling to resist, but Nietzsche saw the opposite to him. Silence could be the mark of an inner self strong enough to no longer need verbal defense. Silence born from fear is retreat, but silence that arises from inner clarity is a declaration. It's when you know exactly what matters to you and what no longer deserves your energy. It's when you're no longer guided by fleeting emotions, but by lasting values. And in that space, you no longer react, you act with intention. Nietzsche once wrote, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." Likewise, someone with a strong enough reason for silence, his unshakable clarity of mind generates a kind of quiet strength, firm as rock, not loud yet unbreakable. In real life, many emotional wounds stem from our inability to tolerate silence. We perceive it as emptiness, rejection, or defeat. But when you've healed enough, you no longer need to fill every quiet space with words, because you now possess the inner certainty to understand. Truth does not need to be shouted. It only needs to be lived. If you're entering a phase where you speak less, respond slower, and only speak up when it truly matters, know that you're not losing your fire. You're entering the mature phase of your soul, and from here, each silent moment will carry more weight than 100 counter-arguments. Every reaction you have reflects the depth of your healing. We often judge others by what they say, but Nietzsche would remind you, watch how someone reacts, especially when challenged, because reactions are never random, they are mirrors of the inner world. The more intense, defensive, or angry a reaction is, the deeper the unhealed wound. Every time someone's words hurt you and you feel the urge to react, pause for a moment. Nietzsche wouldn't tell you to stay silent just to avoid conflict, but he would pour this question into your mind: what inside you is trembling? What remains unhealed that makes it impossible for you to stand still in peace? A soul that has traveled through layers of understanding no longer argues to win. They observe their reactions, like watching a wave rise on a lake's surface. They don't resist it, they let it pass. And through that process, they learn more than any argument could ever teach. Nietzsche never separated philosophy from emotion. He believed that self-overcoming is both an intellectual and emotional journey. Healing is a profoundly philosophical act. You are restructuring how you exist in the world, and it begins with your choice not to react the same way, not because you're weaker, but because you're no longer living from an unhealed, unconscious place. If you've ever surprised yourself with your calm in the face of provocation, if you once prepared to lash out but instead exhaled and smiled, then you are on the right path. The path Nietzsche described as the journey of someone who is no longer a victim of the ego, but its master. And from that point on, external arguments become a distant echo once you've learned to hear the clear voice within. When you ascend to a deeper level of awareness, you begin to realize others not understanding you is no longer a problem, because truth doesn't need agreement to exist, and real value doesn't need recognition to be present. Like a mountain, even shrouded in fog, it remains unmoved. Freedom begins the moment you stop trying to convince the world to understand you, and instead begin to understand the world more deeply instead of asking, "Why don't they understand me?" You start to ask, "What am I reflecting in them? And what within myself have I not yet accepted?" The questions change, and so does your life. Nietzsche didn't ask you to become detached, cold, or indifferent. He pointed toward a transformation from dependence on others' perceptions to self-possession. And when you no longer need to be understood to feel whole, you finally open your heart to understand others, not through a defensive lens, but with calm presence and empathy. That is the person who no longer needs to justify the way they live. They don't react to be understood, don't argue to be right, and don't live to please anyone. They are clear-eyed about their beliefs, and when challenged, they don't collapse. But neither do they retaliate. They simply keep walking, quietly, steadily. In a world full of noise, where everyone is shouting their opinions and identities, the one who chooses to live with depth, authenticity, and awareness is the one walking the path Nietzsche called becoming oneself. And that path doesn't need a signpost. It doesn't need justification. It doesn't need to be understood. You don't need to argue to defend the truth. Let the consistency of your actions speak for you. You don't need to prove who you are. Let the calmness of your presence answer on your behalf. And you don't need to win an argument. If each day you are living as a more meaningful, responsible, and grounded version of yourself. Because in the end, as Nietzsche reminds us, life is not a problem to be explained, but a being to be expressed. And when you live rightly, you no longer need to be right, for your very existence in its quiet strength and integrity becomes the most solid answer to every question others may ask. You don't need the last word in a conversation. You, in the way you live, are the last word already.